Hello everyone, welcome back to the podcast. And today's guest is an author, independent journalist, former CNN News 18 Executive Editor, Anubha Bhonsle from NewsWorthy. Welcome to the show, Anubha.
Thank you so much, Richard, for having me.
Anubha, with so much going on in the internet and, so much content to consume, how do you see the future of content dissemination will be, and how do you manage to tackle so many platforms, especially for newsworthy?
Richard, I have to admit it's an everyday battle because while I was a so-called mainstream journalist and working for CNN-IBN and CNN News 18, your work was so much around journalism. Your work was so much focused around the content, the meaning, the visual imagery, the story itself, and although one thought about dissemination, one didn't spend as much time thinking about dissemination as I do currently in my current avatar. I mean, you're very well aware that most of the work that we're putting on is really on social media platforms. And I think it's a double-edged sword, right? So every day I spend a certain amount of time thinking about the stories I want to do and sort of researching for them or doing the interviews or finding out the backstory or the linkages or facts, etc. And I think an equal amount of time goes in trying to figure out which platform it should go on, how do you master the algorithm, how do you realize the algorithm has suddenly changed. So while on one end, it gives you this immense opportunity to reach a whole host of people, I do find it tiresome, and I don't necessarily feel that more number of platforms have necessarily meant more amount of work or better amount of work. I think it's a bit of both, and sometimes the struggle so much is about being on the platform, and so much of the focus is on that the story itself begins to take a backseat, and which is something that I have to constantly guard myself against. I have to constantly keep telling myself, if you're factful, if you're authentic, if you are trying to tell the story as journalistically, ethically as possible, then it doesn't really matter whether you're going on a blog or a newsletter or a podcast or a Instagram feed, etc.
Yeah, completely understood. And when it comes to story and then storytelling, what do you look for in a particular story or a particular narrative that you are working on? What do you look for?
It's such a tough question, especially when one is an entrepreneur,
Yeah.
because the stories that you necessarily want to tell, you don't have the requisite infrastructure or the resources to tell the story, as well as you'd want to. But I think journalistically, I have been driven to stories. I have been driven to not just telling the stories, but also helping people understand them, right?
The
I have
context,
been
right?
driven, I've been driven to the content, but also the context of it. I have been driven to stories that are, so I'll tell you the things that I don't like to do. Maybe that'll help
Yeah,
answer
that
the
will
question.
really break the ice.
Yeah, so I think I have never liked to work a lot in terms of standing outside politicians' houses or that kind of sort of rigor. And I have great respect for, especially in the broadcast medium, journalists who do that.
Yeah.
I typically want to stay with the story. I do not believe that people are able to articulate what is happening to them as it is happening to them. Everybody needs to be able to sit back, whether it's a moment of tragedy, whether it's a moment of grief, whether it's shock, whether it's awe, whether it's a natural disaster, whether it's any story. I don't think people fully realize what has happened to them as it is happening to them. They do need a moment to just think about. And I think if journalists typically are patient, are willing to let people speak, you will find amazing stories. You will find amazing linkages, amazing backstories. So those are the stories I want to tell. I also want to, typically, while I've done a little bit of it, I often want to stay away from, sort of this anniversary journalism that used to happen a lot while I was in television, right? You come back to someone on the first anniversary, then the second anniversary, and in between, you just forget about people.
Yeah.
So, I think human resilience also is sort of a factor that interests me. I also like to typically, even if it's a legal story or if it's a law, I am very, very interested in, yes, understanding sort of the nuts and bolts of the law, but as interested in its application and how it impacts people's lives.
Yeah. More of the people aspect of the story, I would say, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what missing in most of the cases, because no brainer for me, because I'm not from the journalism background to be I'll put it out right out front, and then
So lucky.
yeah, I come from a corporate background, so how did Newsworthy come about, and why you choose to be independent rather than working for a big media house?
Richard, to be honest, if a decade or so ago, or even at the start of my career, you ever asked me this question, I would have not said that I am going to be an entrepreneur or an entrepreneurial venture is sort of my dream, etc. Typically I used to joke with my friends that I am not the person. I'm the person who calls someone to say, hey, the printer's not working. I don't know how to fix the printer myself. But now in this current venture, I am everything. I fix the printer, I get the coffee, I write the script, I call the guests, I do everything, right? So why? I have answered this question, various times over the last couple of years. But I will be honest, and I will tell you. So I think the first time I ever felt that I was not going to be, or I felt sort of a dip in mainstream media, was I think around 2014. I was the executive editor at CNN-IBN. And shortly after the general elections, the entire network was sort of taken over by Reliance Industries. And, our entire management was sort of forced out journalistically. Our editor-in-chief and many senior editors were sort of were taken away, and there was a vacuum. So we were the second leadership, and there was a vacuum. And for some reasons, we weren't allowed to go and we didn't leave, etc. It was a mix of both. And I have to say that 1 year was just an inclination for me as to the overt and the subliminal way in which pressure can sort of be put, and which is not to say that some of this did not exist in the past. Like, I'm not giving the past a clean sheet to say that everything was hunky-dory. It's not that, but I think it was the first time where it became apparent to me that it will be overt, it will be transparent, it will be said to you, and you can choose to fight it every day. You can choose to sort of adhere to what is being asked of you, or you can simply choose to exit. So I think I spent about a year and a half fighting it almost on sort of a daily basis. And I'm not saying that sort of some big ticket pressure was coming, but it was coming in subliminal small ways. And often I talk about it, pressure and fear, can happen in many ways. It just doesn't have to be on what you have to do. It can also be on what you don't have to do, right? And no one ever gets to know what you haven't done, right? So, and I left, I think I stayed for about a year or so, and I left for the US at that point in time. I was also working on my book. So things fell into place. I went on a fellowship abroad. I stayed in the US for about 2 years. I was supposed to be there only for about a year, but my visa kept getting extended, and I stayed on for about 2 years. I covered the US elections there for my channel. I was still employed there. And I think my eyes, sort of my vista opened up. I was no longer a frog in the well. I was seeing different ways to work. I was seeing different skill sets. I was seeing what the world was doing. I was seeing how inefficient we were in many ways that we worked in television. I also realized deep rooted strengths. So it was a mixed bag. And I came back. I mean, I think I came back for sort of personal reasons. But I came back. But I know the day I joined back my channel, I knew from day one that I would not be able to do any work that I considered valuable. It was wasn't going to be able to do that because the structures had dramatically changed. There was a dumbing down. There was an anti sort of intellectual setup, right? You didn't have to do certain things. So I stayed on only barely for nine months or so in my second stint, and by that time I had already spent about 20 years in broadcast. So it wasn't an easy decision. It also wasn't a decision that I had thought through very clearly. So it's not as if I had another job or I had thought through this venture completely. But I thought that I had a strong body of work. I had strong credibility. And I owed it to myself to see what I could do. So I think from about 2017 end till almost about 2019, I did a lot of independent work. I did a lot of freelance work. I did a lot of reporting. I helped organizations set up. I was an ICFJ fellow, which stands for the International Center for Journalists. So I was just exposed to many different things. And I think from that came the juice that I needed to set up something of my own. And I think one part of it was also because I thought I had a body of work, and suddenly you realize that it always belonged to somebody else, right? When I was at CNN-IBN, it belonged to them. They decided to pull it out, put it, redo it. So yeah, I mean, I've given you a really long story, but I think from that urge to do the stories that I wanted to tell, that were far more meaningful, that helped people understand. Typically, I think in my last stint when I was watching TV, I just couldn't understand myself. I never understood a story, and I was like to wonder how will the world understand what is happening.
Exactly, exactly. And we have seen quite a lot of new media startup
Yeah.
in India. And how do you differentiate Newsworthy with the rest of them? And how do you plan to with the current scenario of the digital laws and
Yeah.
regulation being changed, I mean, without notice, even prior notice. So how do you think things will move on in the future?
So, I've been trying to sort of study the rules and regulations right since the draft has come out and stuff. And clearly, we haven't formulated a strategy completely as newsworthy, but I think there is a very, very strong bearing for us. So it's something that I have to think about very, very clearly and set up perhaps a little more structured systems in place if one is to do it. But to also answer your question as to how do I differentiate, considering there is a great plethora of small outfits, independent journalists, digital news outfits, etc. So Richard, I think this is my sense, and maybe I am wrong, but I think we will go through a phase of a lot of proliferation of sort of similar outfits, primarily because of the squeeze that you're seeing on sort of the so-called mainstream media, right? So I think one is going to see more and more of this. And, what is common to everybody? We are small. Most of the teams are typically 2 to 3 people. Uh, for most people, either the funding is coming in through a grant, or the funding is coming in through, let's say, a YouTube, or sort of monetizing those aspects. But I think what is also extremely important is that they're telling the stories that are simply not visible anywhere else in the so-called mainstream media. Most of the digital news outfits are sort of running on small budgets, etc. I do feel that there will be a period of more proliferation and then a period of sort of coming together and, pulling in resources and sort of, working to our strengths. How do I differentiate? I think the one big factor that I which is either a plus or a minus, obviously, is the fact that my social media footprint, considering everybody is disseminating through social media, right? My social media footprint is comparably very, very small to many and larger from some others. So I am standing somewhere sort of, maybe on this side of the spectrum. I don't have a large footprint. Um, I think my differentiation is that I'm not trying to replicate TV on digital. I am not attempting to do another debate, another conversation on digital. That's not my idea of doing it. My idea is also, I also come from a deep place that I don't think people should be just constantly scrolling. I don't believe that is a way to consume news intelligently, etc. Uh, I believe that it has to be made available to people in a way that helps them understand why this news is important for them. We also have to remember that for years now, the mainstream media is sort of populated our minds with these loud graphics, constant shouting. So I think, it is almost a learning for people to be able to hear someone speak calmly, explain. I think it's also a process. So I think those are also where my strengths lie. And I often feel uh, popularity and credibility are two different things. And I may not have the social media footprint of a popular journalist. Not to say that they are not credible, but I don't have that. But I think I have strong credibility. Um, I think because I kept a distance between the time I left mainstream and the time I started this, I think that gave me a chance to think through a lot of structures. So a lot of people ask me, how are you funded, right? Uh, I don't have a grant. I don't have a grant coming in from an organization. I Even if I was monetizing something on social media on some of the platforms, etc., like a YouTube, the amount is going to be so less, right? I'm not creating sort of the next viral video. That is not also what I want to create, right? So I learned it pretty early on that the way for me to do the work that I want to do will never be able to get like 1 million views, right? It may get whatever, a couple of thousand views, and it may actually be meaningful to people who are watching it. And therefore, my sort of revenue stream has to come somewhere around that I don't have the infrastructure currently to mass produce. I don't have the infrastructure to create the virality. So what am I creating? And if that is of value to people, who is it of value to? And that's what eventually people would want to pay for or would pay for. Maybe I'm taken completely wrong, but so far that's where my thinking is. And so far I have funded it through other collaborations that I have done, which have obviously come from my own skill set, but also because I'm invested also in the industry, right? I'm not just invested in myself and my newsworthy. I don't think newsworthy can ever do well if the industry is collapsing.
Exactly. And like you've mentioned, for any new media startup, the biggest challenge here is financing it. One, and and you and I both know very well that social media monetization and all of those stuff are, I mean, close to impossible. And also, like you have mentioned that we cannot replicate the mainstream media in today's generation. I mean, the generation before us might be used to reading newspaper or reading printed material, but the generation now has a attention span of maybe 3 seconds, 5 seconds, and if we can't grab that, then we already lose it. And in order to do that, we have to also really understand the way we disseminate, like we discussed a few days back.
Yeah.
Each platform has to be tackled differently and all of those stuff. So yeah, you make a really good point in why Newsworthy is different from the other startup. And for people who are listening, I would put the description of Newsworthy social media and how you can follow them, and you can find it on the description. And Anubha, how does your experience working with mainstream media, is there any situation or any issues that you face because of the gender while working for the corporate?
So, Richard, I think I came from a place of fair privilege. In many ways, like, the social structure where I came from, the opportunities that were available to me, the education that was made available to me from my family background, etc. So I come from a point of fair privilege. So, and I think, it's great that you brought up this conversation, especially at a time like we are going through currently, where there has been this great judgment, in the case related to Priya and Mr. M.J. Akbar. And, what struck me about when that verdict came out, of course, a lot of people felt very happy, pleased, motivated that justice was done. But I think what struck me was, look at how low the bar is. I mean, look at what are we celebrating? We
Yeah.
are celebrating that victim, I mean, and I use the word victim in quotes, was not put in jail or was not tried, right? I mean,
Yeah.
because she was facing charges, she was made to be the accused. So that is what we are fighting against. But to your question, I will say it, I will answer, I mean, and there's nothing to shy away from it, but I will answer it this way, and I've answered it in many fora before as well. At the time that I came into journalism, the level of awareness about some of this was extremely low, right? And one accepted some of these things as a given,
Yeah.
right? And one also went along with it because you did not want to be sort of tagged as the troublemaker, or you do not want to be tagged as someone who would create a problem, or someone who is weak, or someone or you thought that you wouldn't be sent on an assignment if you said this, right?
Yeah.
And I think those are not the fears of this generation. Those are not even the fears of the teams I led while in mainstream media. And I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
that is a great change that has happened. And I know of many women in my generation who faced some of this, but never let it out in the open, never confronted it. Uh, Primarily because we thought we'd be tagged as all of these things. But having said that, I mean, I also have to say that I have worked under some great editors and not have had to face this in an overt manner. But I think, again, this is sort of our conditioning that I'm still trying to I still try to say that, I faced it, but not that much. And the fact should be that I shouldn't have had to face it at all, right? So that is a conditioning that still refuses to leave me even now, even though I work in gender, even though I work on issues like this. But I think that's the big change that has happened, and I think it's an absolutely welcome change that has happened. I also feel that and I'm calling out the media here, I also feel that within our newsrooms, I don't think the seriousness of this has percolated. This is still considered a hassle, I know of many friends of mine and good male friends who in casual conversations used to say, don't do this or you'll be me too'd. It became like a verb, and it will happen to you, and it'll just happen to you on anything. So yeah, I don't think our newsrooms have sort of realized that this is not just about setting systems in place or a committee or getting in 5 members. This is far more deep rooted than that. And but I think I also mentioned what the positive of all of this has been.
And do you think that given that if you are the opposite gender, and in your career you'd have progressed much more than where you left?
Yes and no. I think perhaps. I also think again that this is an awareness that came in much later, an awareness of pay parity, of not getting the same pay for the same work or much more work. I think that still happens, and I think it used to happen in my case as well. I think also structurally, many newsrooms often tend to become boys' clubs, where I do remember of a time when we called out an editor because important decisions that were editorial were being taken at what is called, what in television parlance was called a caro bar, which was a bar in a car. Right? And that bar in a car used to open up after the last bulletin or after a good primetime bulletin had gone, and the guys would get together and sort of, just casually discuss what was going to happen the next day. And when you came for the morning meeting the next day, you realized that a decision had been taken, and you kept wondering why, how, what, where did I miss? But I know that once we called it out, that practice was, I don't know, at least I thought brought to an end. The Karabar didn't stop, but they stopped talking sharp. So I don't know. Yeah. So I think in all these ways, yeah.
And you wrote a book on Manipur, Irom and Irom Sharmila, called Mothers Were My Country. And this was in 2016.
Yes.
In retrospect, is there anything you would have written differently looking back now?
I think when I think about the book, first of all, I can't believe that I wrote it. Writing a book is such a sort of solitary and lonely experience. I often think that the book should have been written sooner. Right? I think not that that story wasn't relevant then or wasn't as important then or isn't as important today, but I think perhaps that story and many more stories of that kind or of the region or of the conflict have to be written. I think because it was my first book and I had sort of very limited experience of writing it, I think I always wanted it to be a book of reportage, which it was. I always wanted it to be set in a non-fiction setting, which it was. I think I may have done some bits a little differently in terms of making it more accessible, if that can be said. But I thought that I tried to do a very sort of strenuous job of being true to what I was writing about, and yet sort of try to create an awareness around it. People often sort of look at the book as just the story of Sharmila, and I often have to tell them that it isn't just the story of Sharmila. She is a character in that entire book, and there were many reasons why I felt compelled that her story had to be told. but it's also the book about what the human cost of sort of conflict or low intensity conflict can be, on a state, on its people, on its culture, on its habits,
Yeah.
on everything. Yeah.
And you've been closely working with her during those times, right? With Sharmila.
Yeah, so I think I first started, and I never thought of it as a book earlier, right? It was just something that it was a story that I started following and something that I kept going back to year after year since, if I remember correctly, 2006. And I think it's a little bit of what I said earlier, that, it was just the rigor and the patience that is expected of a journalist, and that is expected when you are speaking to people who sort of bear the impact of everyday conflict in a way, right? So it
Yeah.
was it was just about being there a lot and being there often. And Sharmila at that point in time used to be under arrest, so it was a year of arrest, and then she was released and a year of arrest. So
Yeah.
it just meant that every time I had to be there when she was released.
Yeah, yeah. And even though we have women from our region, like the Northeast region, who have struggled to be heard, or have written books about it, and especially with what the Indian Army has done to them, and how do you think your work will contribute in terms of shaping the understanding of how we categorize a woman, and violence intersect within, say, for an instance, Manipur?
So, I'm hoping the book has, to a very limited extent, it's not the only work. It obviously can't be the only defining work. And there is a lot of other work that has been written by people who belong to the region, whose voices are far more authentic, and whose voices carry that experience far greater than mine, right?
Yeah.
I was still technically an outsider writing
Yeah.
about it all, right? Uh, but I think what it did was that it it tried to understand the landscape that had all these actors that you're talking about, the landscape that had the Indian Army, the landscape that had messy politics, the landscape that had this one woman who showed immense fortitude, resilience, grit, and whose own ideas were sometimes so strong that one used to wonder, has she really thought about what she's doing? How does it pan out? I mean, in those initial years, that used to be the question. And anytime I told people about this story, right? Why is she doing this? Like, really? She doesn't want to eat, she doesn't want to drink. How does that solve anything? How does such a strong, non-violent method serve anything? So I think it led to a better understanding about all these actors, and not just Sharmila. I know Sharmila was representative, but Manipur has not one Sharmila or not one woman who just carries that strength. I mean, it is peppered with so many stories of so many women and men and young women who carry such fortitude within them. So I don't think one book can do everything. I don't think one story can do
Yeah.
everything. I
Yeah.
don't think one journalist can do everything. But I think it was an important perspective in trying to understand what the human cost of that conflict has been. And
Yeah.
I think it was also a reminder to a lot of people that just because a large amount of time passes, the quest for justice or the quest for equality doesn't go away just because something happened, in the 1970s. Asking people to move on is, I don't know who told me that, but asking people to move on is a luxury, right? I mean,
Yeah.
only some people can tell other people to move on. It's not easy for the person to who it has happened.
Exactly. And also, like, in when you look at Northeast, for example, Nagaland state or Manipur, inside of Manipur as well, it's very diverse. When it comes to, like, for example, my district, Churchandpur, even within that there is so many tribes, so many, people who want their own statehood. Now, especially with Naga, there are a lot of community member who are writing about it, talking about it, and
Yes.
one, for example, is Temsula Ao, who has been
Yeah.
writing really well, thought
Yeah.
what happens to them, and but the thing is that never they were part of the actual important discussion. So how do
Yeah.
you think,
Yeah.
what is your thoughts on that?
You're so right about it. I mean, Richard, I think you've hit it bang on. And I used to take a gender class. I think a couple of years ago, and I used to often show these two images that you're talking about. That in Manipur, whenever there were, civil society protests or, a candlelight march or sitting in silence against an atrocity or against any wrong, you always found women in the public space,
Yeah.
right? So I used to always show those images, and I used to show the image of the peace talk. That is, I think it was in 2015 when Mr. Muiwa was called to the Seven Race Course Road, and the Prime Minister is there, and Mr. N. Ravi is there, and a whole lot of men are there. So I used to show these two images that when the protests, etc., are happening, you are seeing so many women in the public discourse. But when the big ticket announcements are being made, or the peace talks, or the framework is being talked about, you see a complete absence of women in the so-called peacemaking process, right?
Yeah.
And the thing is that you're absolutely right. I mean, not just, Tamsula Ao, I have sort of read her books and sometimes read them repeatedly because the imagery is so beautiful and the nuance is so excellent. Same for many others, right? Even in Nagaland, Dolly Kikon, so many others. I mean, some of these women are writing brilliant insights, but I think there is a large part of India that is unaware of it. There is a large part of India that has not read them. And I think a lot of times these high level talks that happen tend to be entirely dominated by men, although women in peacemaking is a very strong discipline. What women bring to any peace talk is now an internationally recognized strong discipline. And my thoughts to it are, to sum it up, I would say, it's reflective of how sort of the large parts of India are, right? Completely, all of this is completely unknown to them. And the same actually also reflects in our polity, right?
Yeah.
But having said that, I also have to say that, often in all of these peacemaking processes, it's not as if women are not used for the back channel talks, right? Even in sort of the Naga framework or the Naga peace talks, groups of sort of women have been used in the back channel, but when it
Yeah.
comes to the forefront, they are completely absent. And there's widespread studies internationally, Richard, to showcase that peace frameworks, peace processes do benefit from women on the table, and not just women getting a seat at the table, but having actually a say in that. The peace is
Yeah.
long lasting, the peace, they tend to look at different things. There is a very strong reasoning for bringing gender into peacemaking processes, which we haven't in this case.
I know you might have seen Karan and Karan Thapar and Muiwa interviews on the wire,
Yes.
and
Yes.
one of the things that Muiwa said, we've never been part of the constitution; they are imposed on us. So, if they have never been part of our, if we have never been part of the constitution and the boundary has been drawn without our conscience, then labeling the freedom fighter here in the Northeast as insurgent or
Rebel.
a terrorist, will that be a little bit too much?
So, see, I think that's a crisis, or not a crisis. That's a question that used to come every time we used to talk about the NSC and IM, right? At least
Yeah.
in the larger mainstream terminology or the mainstream sort of news space. What do you call them? Do you call them an insurgent outfit? Do you call them a rebel group? What do you call them, right? Now, the fact is that the two states were brought into sort of the Indian Union, and the way of their assimilation was not acceptable to everybody. And I mean, the government has actually been in talks with them for the last so many decades, right?
Yeah.
So this is a crisis, and sometimes this crisis also reflects in Jammu and Kashmir, right? So
Yeah.
when you have sort of homegrown insurgents, you want to call them militants, and when they're coming in from across the border, from across the line of control, we are calling them terrorists. And often there is this sort of large debate as to why you call one and the other. But I think this is a debate that may perhaps not even find an end. If you did find it may find an end only after you have some kind of a solution that comes out of these peace talks, right? If the demand
Exactly.
for a separate constitution or a separate flag is sort of given up or is agreed to in different ways, I think then you may find a sense, then you may find an answer to that, right? I think someone put out a video very, very recently of the first time the national anthem was sung in the assembly, in the Nagaland State Assembly. I think it was someone put out a video of that, and I didn't realize, I hadn't realized that was the case till so long.